really a big weekend for you to spend some time working on your paper. So first off, remember that your paper proposals are due today. I said noon, but honestly, I would prefer to have a good proposal than one that you rip through. And so if you need a couple of hours this afternoon, honestly, just get it to me by 5 o'clock tonight, okay? If you have it done, send it to me so I can get it back to you sooner. I would appreciate you send it to me earlier, but if you need a little bit of time this afternoon, I would prefer to have a good, thoughtful proposal, because I'm not really grading these. This is really for you, right? This is really to give you feedback. And so, if you can get those to me early this afternoon or mid-afternoon, then I can review them tonight and get them back to you so that you really have the whole day, Saturday and Sunday, to begin doing, some work. So that's kind of the plan with that. I think a couple of you have sent me your proposals, and I've already gotten you feedback on those. And so, yeah, anyway, that's the thing to do. So we are not going to have class this afternoon. Okay, we're just going to have class this morning. I want to review your exam. I want to talk about that Barrow paper that I sent you. And then that's it. So this afternoon, once again, that's really time for you to make sure that you get your proposal and send it to me. And if you've gotten your proposal back from me, that's really a good time to, begin working. So does anybody have any questions before we move to the exam? Does anybody have any questions about the paper, the proposal? Any questions about the structure or, what's expected of us here going forward? So if you hold on one moment here. So just kind of think about where we're going next week and what you need to be working toward. On Tuesday, we're going to have, no, not on Tuesday, sorry. On Wednesday, your first draft is due, okay? And so what that means is that you should have, as close as you can get to a finished product, the better. Right? And so what we're going to do is on Wednesday, you're going to share those drafts with me. You're also going to share those drafts with one other member of the class. And then I'm going to give you detailed comments back, hopefully by Thursday or Friday. And then on Wednesday night, you're going to read somebody else's paper and give feedback to them on Thursday. All right, so you're really going to get feedback from me, and you're going to get feedback from one of your classmates. And so the idea here is that if you can get a good first draft done by Wednesday, you'll get feedback on that first draft, and then you'll have time next weekend to both complete your second draft, but then also to put together a brief presentation that we're going to be doing on Monday and Tuesday. And so, that's kind of where we're going here over the next week with your paper. So, all right, any other questions about the paper? Okay, let's talk about the exam. What to say about the exam? I felt a little bit like the exam was feast or famine, in the sense that I think a number of us did very well on the exam, and really a couple of you really knocked it out of the park, did a great job on the exam. And then a couple of you struggled, and it seemed like the struggle, had less to do with answers that were wrong and more to do with answers that just weren't answered, right? Whether you ran out of time, I don't know exactly what happened for a couple of you, but a couple of you left a lot of it or too much of it unanswered. And so, I don't know if that was confusion or if that was just simply running out of time. It is a different experience, I'll agree, taking an exam online, right, and having to write everything on your computer. And so, anyway, I don't know what happened. Overall, I felt pretty good about how we did on the exam. But, there were also a couple of you that didn't do so well. And so I would be happy to talk with any of you individually. And I'll have a little bit of time after class today, so we can set up some time after class if you want to set up an appointment. This afternoon's a little busy for me, so I might be able to set up a brief appointment for you this afternoon. We could also talk tomorrow or Sunday or on Monday. So, if you want to stay on after class this morning, I will hang out for a couple of minutes. And like I said, happy to talk to you then. Or, we can just set up another appointment here over the next couple of days. Excuse me. Let's briefly go over the exam, and just to make sure that we understand kind of why we missed the things that we did. Because, obviously understanding particularly some of the stuff about the Solow model and endogenous growth models is really going to be important for you in putting together your paper, because your paper is really going to, in many ways, be assuming the papers that you read, assume that you know all this stuff, right? So analysis in the Solow model, here's this figure. This is S, right? From the Solow model on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is per capita GDP. And so what do we see here? Is it true in the Solow model that higher S leads to higher per capita GDP? Yes, right? And so yes, this illustrates a positive relationship, but it's important to note that this relationship is not perfect, right? And the Solow model doesn't say that it should be perfect. First off, because different countries could be different levels away from their steady state or their balanced growth path. And astrally, it says more about your balanced growth path than it does about what your current income level is. And then also there's other things that impact output in the Solow model, like population growth, technology, education, right? But yeah, in general, this is consistent with the Solow model. B, here, the world has recently experienced a series of natural disasters. What impact would this have on economic growth? Well, to my conception, this mainly destroys capital, right? This mainly destroys capital. So how I envision this is this reduces countries below their balanced growth rate by reducing capital. So what should happen? Kind of counterintuitively, these countries will see their income levels go down, but their growth rates will go up, right? Because now they're farther away, they're below their balanced growth path. So in the short run, they grow faster. In the long run, their growth rate goes back to where it was. Their income level goes back to where it was, but it takes a transition period. Okay, consider a Solow economy. Here, this is part, I don't know what happened to part C, but part D here, consider an economy where you're given oops, sorry, I don't have my iPad plugged in. Okay, so consider a Solow economy where your balanced growth path is, what do I say, 500, right? And you're down here at 300, and then you're given capital that moves you up to 400. What should happen as a result of this? Well, first off, your per capita output will go up, right? Per capita output goes up, but your growth rate actually goes down. And in the long run, what does this aid get you? Nothing, right? I mean, it gets you getting to the balanced growth path faster, so I shouldn't say nothing. That is an important thing, but it's not going to change how rich your country is in the long run, right? Likewise, what happens if you're at the balanced growth path and then you're given 100 so that you're up here at 600? This is part E. Well, in this case, income goes up, but then you actually have negative growth as you go back to the balanced growth path. And so what does these answers mean about why aid has not been effective? Well, because aid really changes capital. In the long run, capital isn't the biggest determinant of how rich you are or how fast you grow. And so that is institutions and technology, right? And so, aid can help in the short run, but it's unlikely, at least in the Solow model, to permanently change output in the long run. And then finally, the last part here. When looking at data on economic growth across countries and individuals, is convergence occurring? Let me switch back to the exam. Is convergence occurring? This is this part. And the answer is yes and no. It is, we do observe convergence among rich countries and developing countries, meaning countries that are growing, right? We also observe convergence among individuals, right? In part because two of the biggest countries in the world are two of the countries that are converging, China and India. But to say that we are experiencing absolute convergence, meaning everybody, is not right, right? That there are still a lot of countries that are not converging, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And so, you know, there's not a simple yes, no to this. And what I was looking for in this answer is, you know, for you to kind of capture some of the complexity of this question about whether there's convergence or not. Okay, education and growth. Discuss the Mankiw model, Romer and Wheel. Well, in Mankiw, in this Mankiw, Romer and Wheel model, human capital only impacts the level of output in the long run. It does not impact the growth rate, okay? So if you spend more on education, it increases the level of output, but not the growth rate. And I'm not gonna go through the details of this model, they're in your notes. Compare this with the Lucas model of endogenous growth. Well, in the Lucas model of endogenous growth, having human capital leads to having more human capital. So spending more on education leads to an increase in growth rates as well as an increase in income levels. So the key difference here is that in the Lucas model, there are these spillover effects or increasing returns to scale, that when you have more human capital, you create more human capital. That is not part of the Mankiw, Romer, and Wheel model. What's the education boom? This is the dramatic spending on education and increases in primary school enrollments. Was it successful? Not really. And in part because many countries are poor, not because they lack education, but because they lack all the complementary inputs, such as technology and institutions. What causes brain drain? Well, brain drain is simply a fact of leaks and matches, right? So if you have human capital, you want to go where there's other people that have human capital. Does it discourage growth? Why or why not? Well, it's actually not clear. Yes, it does discourage growth in terms of some people who are educated leave, but the fact is that not everybody who gets an education will leave, or if they do leave, many of them come back. And so the evidence on this is actually quite complex. And why am I forgetting? One of us are doing a paper on brain drain. What can I think? Is that you, Molly, that's doing the brain drain paper? Right, yeah. So Molly's actually, her literature review is going to be on brain drain. So she will have a lot more to say about this question in her paper. Okay. So, ideas and technology. Discuss the market structure for the production of ideas. What was I looking for here? That you would talk about non-rivalry, you talk about fixed costs, and you talk about imperfect competition, right? Those were kind of the three magic words that I was looking for in this discussion, that you were talking about how ideas have non-rivalry, fixed costs, and those lead to imperfect competition. So what's the role of government? Because we have imperfect competition, we have market failure, and governments can overcome market failure by treating ideas like a public good, meaning subsidizing research and development and possibly providing patent protection. In the Romer model, ideas are produced according to the following production function. How is this different from the Solow model? Well, in the Romer, having more ideas leads to creating more ideas. Okay, so you have that increasing returns to scale, which leads to growth, right? So in the Solow model, growth is completely exogenous. In Romer, you can create growth, you can create ideas through R&D, and having ideas leads to creating more ideas. What does your discussion say about convergence? Well, Solow, as we know, predicts convergence, but Romer actually predicts divergence. And why is that? Because having ideas leads to you creating more ideas. So the rich get richer, the poor stay poor. And finally, what about an increase in population in Romer? If you increase population in Romer, you have more people. More people means more ideas. More ideas mean you grow faster. This is different from Solo, which really took a more Malthusian approach, that the more people you have to feed, diminishing marginal returns kick in. And so you actually get poor on a per capita basis. Which model do you think is most persuasive? I guess this is a matter of opinion, but I do think that the Romer model is more persuasive because as we've seen global population go up, we've actually seen increases in people's per capita standard of living. Okay. Please ask me a question as we go through this. I'm just trying to rattle through this fairly quickly, but slow me down if you need me to. Okay, define what economists mean by institutions. We define this many times as institutions are created by societies and government that incentivize productive behavior as opposed to theft or redistributive behavior. Are they the same thing as culture? No. Institutions can change quickly. Culture does not, right? So culture is part of institutions, but they are not the same thing as institutions, right? Institutions can be impacted by government policy, right? Which can change quite dramatically. As we're going to talk about next week, culture changes very slowly, right? But we'll actually come back to this question next week and talk about what is the role of culture in institutions. In the Solo model, where are institutions? Well, institutions really determine those exogenous variables of S, N, U, and G. So they're really the things that determine the exogenous variables, but they're not really explained in the Solo model. And so do you find that sufficient? Well, I don't, right? Because just calling something exogenous, it's simple, it simplifies the model, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of insight. What role do institutions play in growth miracles? Well, growth miracles and growth disasters almost always begin with a change in institutions. And so if you think about this in terms of the Solo model, institutions change, that changes those exogenous variables in the Solo model, which change the balanced growth path, and then we get growth. And finally here, the last question, where do institutions come from? Discuss Acemoglu and Johnson's ideas regarding the historical origins of institutions. This is really from the article on settler mortality. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about how increased settler mortality led to the establishment of extractive institutions, which because of path dependence lasted for long periods of time. All right, that's the point of their article. And then the political economy of institutions. Here I was looking for you to talk a little bit about what makes for good government. And as we talked about in the second reading from Acemoglu and Johnson, good government is that shackled Leviathan, right? Meaning it's the government that exerts control, but not too much control, right? That balances the needs of the people versus the needs of the elites. And so if you get too far off the path of balancing the needs for the elites versus the needs of the people, you can have bad government, right? Have any of you been following this GameStop thing, right? It's kind of fascinating, right? It's really kind of fascinating. And this debate about what the role of government is, you can see this in every story, even the GameStop, right? So for those of you, I am not really going to get into all this GameStop, but I just kind of talk to you, those of you who've been following it. But really, once again, this is the whole debate about GameStop and whether this is right or wrong is really an argument of the power of elites versus the power of populism, right? Should majority rule determine everything in markets, in our government, right? And so in our politics, we've had this real rise in populism, both on the right and the left. And, I think economic history tells us that's not great, right? Just like a rise in the power of elites is not great either, right? That good governments balance these things between the power of the elites and the power of the people. Elites have to have some power, right? They're elites. They have things that they can provide to society, right? So we have to invest the elites. We can't completely have a society in which populists overrun the rights of elites. Likewise, we can't have societies in which elites overrun the ideas of populists. So I know a lot of people are really excited about the what small small traders have done here with GameStop, but I can't help but be worried about this, right? When a bunch of people can get together and essentially impose majority rule on everything, including the stock market, right? It's worrisome. I have to say, it's worrisome to me. So anyway, that was a little aside. But just for you, those of you who've been kind of hung up on GameStop, like I've been the last couple of days, right? Okay. So where does this exam put us in terms of the overall course grade? Well, this exam is, probably about, I didn't really actually calculate it, but probably about 30% of your course grade. So it's an important part of your course grade, but it's not everything, right? And so we still have a lot to go. There's going to be a final. The final is going to be worth less than the midterm, but there will be a final. Your paper, class participation is a very important part of this. And so, I don't want anybody to absolutely panic and jump ship, right? Because I still think that all of you have a possibility of getting good grades in this class. But then again, right, if you didn't do well on this exam, this is an opportunity to think about, why didn't I do well? Was it preparation, or was it that I'm not getting something? And so I'm happy to talk with all of you individually about this, about where you are in the class, what I saw when I looked at your exam, and kind of think about a strategy for going forward. So like I said, after class, if any of you want to hang out for a little bit, I will be here to talk, or we can set up an appointment later. Okay, that is it for the midterm. So let's move on to today's material. And this is actually going to be a pretty short class. I don't think we're going to, I don't think it'll take us too long for us to talk about this paper. So we're going to talk about this paper on the empirics of economic growth by Robert Barro. And I didn't give you this whole paper. I only gave you the first 36 pages, which I'm sure for most of you felt like plenty. But let's talk about this. And why did I assign this paper for us to talk about? So why did I assign this paper? Well, for a big reason. Many of you are covering papers in your literature review that have a pretty significant empirical component. Okay, so first off, I thought it would be useful for us to go through another paper, an empirically based paper, and maybe try to glean some insight that will help us read all of our papers. But there's another reason, that many of you actually have papers that cite this paper, because this paper is kind of how should I say it, a cornerstone paper in the empirical literature. This presents the Barro model of economic growth. So you might actually see in your papers a reference to the Barro model, right? And this is an econometric model. It's not a theoretical model, but it's an empirical model. So the Barro model of an economic growth. And so, as I said, many of you, well, I don't know if many of you, but some of you likely will see references to this paper. And so in many ways, this is kind of, the standard model of economic growth. So in other words, one thing that many of your, many studies have done over the years is say, I think X is important in economic growth. Okay, well, how are you going to prove that? Well, what they do is they take the Barrow model of economic growth and they add X. And then they say, does this improve on the Barrow model when I add this variable, right? And so the Barrow model in many ways has become, as I said, kind of like this standard economic model, right? The standard. And it really is a version of the Solow model. It's a version of the Solow model. It's an econometric version of the Solow model. Okay? And the focus of this model is on the idea that we know that comes from the Solow model on conditional convergence. Right? The focus on conditional convergence. You can get conditional convergence. Instead of writing out conditional convergence, I'm just going to use CC here. And we know why you can get conditional convergence in the Solow model. One, diminishing marginal returns. Right, diminishing marginal returns. The other reason why you can get conditional convergence, this is not in the Solow model, but we've talked about this, is the idea of technology transfer. Right, the idea of technology transfer. That countries can catch up. Because of diminishing marginal returns, or because they can borrow the existing technology of other countries. So remember what conditional convergence tells us. If there's two countries that have the same balanced growth path, the poor one will grow faster. Right? Why? Because of diminishing marginal returns and because of technology transfer. But note that Romer and other endogenous growth models they don't predict conditional convergence. Right? So this is really a function of the Solow model, right? The Solow model predicts conditional convergence. But when we move to endogenous growth models like, Romer, and as we just talked about in the exam, right? Your exam asked the same question. Does the Romer model predict convergence? No, it predicts divergence. Because in the Romer model, the more technology you have, the more technology you create, the faster you grow. Okay? So, what this paper is really testing is, do we observe this? Do we observe this? Do we observe that two countries that have the same balanced growth path, the poorer one will grow faster? Okay, so let's talk about the empirical framework for conditional convergence. What this paper is going to say is, What's a country's per capita growth rate? It's a function of two things. What your income was in 1960, meaning in the distant past, and what your balanced growth path is. So growth today is a function of how rich you were in 1960 and what your balanced growth path is. And Y star depends on S and N and U and G. Now, here's the key. What should be true about the coefficient on this variable? If countries were richer in 1960, everything else being equal, if conditional convergence holds, countries that were richer in 1960 should grow faster or slower? Slower, right? In other words, this should be a negative relationship if conditional convergence holds. This should be a negative relationship. The richer you were in 1960, the poorer you should be growing today. The poorer you should be growing. So ceteris paribus, the richer your country was in 1960, the richer your country was in 1960, the slower you have grown since then. This is, once again, conditional convergence. Right? The key here, though, is ceteris paribus. The key here is ceteris paribus. So, from the Barrow paper here, your author has this graph that says, here's the correlation between what income was, and this is income in 1960. Okay, so on the horizontal is income in 1960 and how fast you've grown since 1960. If there's convergence, what should the relationship be? It should be negative relationship, right? If there's convergence, there should be a negative relationship. But do we see a negative relationship here? No. Does that mean that Solow is wrong? No. Because remember what Solow predicts. It predicts not absolute convergence, but conditional convergence, meaning we have to control for differences in the balanced growth path. So just, looking at the correlation between how rich you were in 1960 and how fast you've grown is not what Solow predicted. Solow does not predict that every country in the world will converge. It predicts conditional convergence, meaning controlling for differences in the balanced growth path countries that have similar balanced growth paths should have, I'm messing this up. If two countries have similar balanced growth paths, it's the poor country that will grow faster than the rich country, right? That's what it predicts. So this graph is not a test of the Solow model, okay? It is not a test of the Solow model. to get a test of the Solow model, we have to control for differences in all those variables that can impact the balanced growth path. And so that's what Barrow does, okay? The Barrow model. He's got data from 114 countries. Okay. And he essentially does this. He wants to look at the relationship between growth across these countries and how rich they were in 1960. And then he wants to look at determinants of Y star. Now, obviously, can we directly go out and estimate what a country's balanced growth path is? No, we can't directly estimate this, right? But Solow says we know things that should be correlated with a country's balanced growth path. So he looks at things like schooling, life expectancy, fertility, right? So schooling is basically U, fertility is N. He looks at things like life expectancy as a measure of S, meaning the longer you think you're going to live, the more you're likely to save. Government consumption, meaning how much does the government spend? This is a measure of institutions. He looks at a measure of the rule of law, which is another thing that measures institutions. The terms of trade, which once again is a measure of how open your economy is. Making an argument that open economies should have better institutions. A measure of democracy. Inflation, another measure of institutions. And then region, meaning what part of the world are you in? Okay? So he has a model in which he includes all of these things, right? He's going to include the log of GDP, per capita GDP in 1960, and then he's going to include a bunch of other variables that are essentially capturing what's happening to the balanced growth path. And so his question is, how well does this match the data? And particularly, do we find conditional convergence? And if we do, it means beta 1 should be less than 0, meaning that coefficient on how rich we were in 1960 should be negative. Okay? So let's talk about the results. And you know what, as I say that, because we're going to have a relatively short class today, let's just take an early break. So before we get into all these results and start jumping through the numbers, this is actually probably a pretty good place to take a break. So let's meet back at 9:50. Right, take a quick little break, about a little bit more than 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about, well, what did Barrow actually find, right? And do we find support for conditional convergence? Okay. All right. So I'll meet you back here at 9:50. Okay, everyone. So let's talk about what Barrow found, right? Let's look at the results. And in this paper, it's nice that pretty much all the main results are just in one table, right? This table 1.1. And so let's look at this, right? And talk about these results individually. The first is the log of GDP. Okay, log of GDP. This is looking at conditional convergence, right? This is looking at how rich the country was in 1960. So I don't know why your author, it doesn't make this more clear in the paper, but when they say log of GDP, they're talking about the log of GDP in 1960. And so what do we find? Controlling for all these other variables, countries that were richer in 1960 have grown slower since 1960, right? That is conditional convergence. The fact that this is negative is evidence of conditional convergence. How big is this number? How big is this number? Well, this is the log of GDP. Okay, so why has the author used the log of GDP? As we talked about, when you use log data, you can interpret the coefficient as a growth rate. Okay, you can interpret a coefficient as a growth rate. So, how do we interpret this coefficient? Beta hat 1 is equal to negative 0.0254. The interpretation is I don't want to use gap, sorry. Let me scribble this out. The rate of convergence between two countries is about 2.5% a year. So if I have a rich country and I have a poor country, they get that gap between them closes at about 2.5% a year. Okay, that gap between them closes at about 2.5% a year. Is this fast? Is that a big number or a slow number? Well, if you actually think about it, this is not really fast. It's actually fairly slow, right? According to this number, it would take the average country about 90 years to get to 90% of US per capita GDP. Okay. So this is actually pretty slow. It's actually pretty slow. Interestingly, there's been a number of other studies that have looked at convergence in a whole host of ways. And In fact, what they find is that time and time again, this rate of 2.5% is pretty common. And so this is why, if you remember in the Lucas paper that we talked about, remember the Lucas paper talking about the macroeconomics of the 20th century, how countries start at different times and then they converge over time. What was the rate of convergence he used? 2.5%, right? That's really from this study. But there have been other papers that have shown that, yes, this rate of convergence of 2.5% is pretty constant. And interestingly, it's not just across countries, it's within countries as well. For instance, if you look at the United States and you look at states, rich states and poor states, are they converging? The answer is yes. What's the rate? At about 2.5% a year. If you look at East Germany and West Germany, is it converging? Yes. What's the rate? 2.5% a year, right? If you look within Europe, is there convergence? Yes. What's the rate? About 2.5% a year. So convergence, conditional convergence is happening, right? It is happening. But it's also clear to recognize that it's kind of slow. I mean, this is not the kind of convergence that's going to take place in one generation, right? But it's going to take multiple generations. 90 years in economic time is a long time, So if you go back and you look at, remember before I showed you this picture of looking at how rich you were in 1960 and then how fast you've grown. What happens if I take out from this data, though, Y star, right? All the other, all the difference that can be explained by all these other variables we're going to talk about here in a minute. When I do that, what then becomes a relationship between how rich you were in 1960 and unexplained growth? Negative. That is conditional convergence. So this graph is predicting conditional convergence, and you can see it's pretty strong. It's a pretty strong relationship there between conditional convergence. Okay. So that's the biggest result of the paper, that yes, Barrow does find some evidence of some pretty strong evidence of conditional convergence. What about these other variables that look at how high the balanced growth path is? Which of these appear to be significant predictors of a country's balanced growth path and which don't? Let's talk about these individually. Male secondary and higher schooling. It is significant predictor, right? By the way, I forgot to say, how do I know that it's significant? Well, what's that in the parentheses underneath? That's the standard error, right? So what's the rule of thumb when we're calculating statistical significance? Who can help me out here? Yeah, Chase.
We divide our result by the standard error, and if it's greater than 2, our result can be considered statistically significant.
Exactly. So you'll notice actually all of these are statistically significant, right? Well, at least until we come to the dummies. We'll talk about that later, but all of these variables are statistically significant. So male secondary and higher schooling, statistically significant. Why does Barrow use male? Well, interestingly enough, if you include total schooling, it becomes insignificant. So what's going on there? Well, this is part of the reason why that education boom didn't work, right? Because what happens if you educate women, but then you don't let them work? It's not going to lead to growth. And so if you look at total schooling, you actually don't find any significance. In part, that's because of institutions. That in many countries, many women are not allowed to work, or they have a very difficult time entering the formal labor force. And so, the fact that only male schooling is significant here is really a measure of how bad the institutions are in some countries, right? And it's one reason why just looking at education itself is not really going to be a great predictor of growth, because you can educate people all you want. If you don't let them participate in the labor market, they're not going to create growth. Life expectancy, significant and positive. That makes sense, right? If you think you're going to die when you're 25, there's not a lot of incentive to invest in all of the things that you need to invest in to become productive, like in education or to save for the future. And so the idea here is that if life expectancy goes up, people will save more, they'll invest more in education, and that will increase your balanced growth path. And that's what we find. Now, this next one, this one is tricky, right? This one is tricky. The log of GDP times male schooling. This is negative. What in the world? What in the world is Barrow doing by adding this variable, which is the log of GDP in 1960 times male schooling? This is what we call an interactive term. It's looking at the interaction between GDP in 1960 and schooling. So when you multiply them together and you put them in your model, you're really trying to capture what is the interaction between them. The coefficient here is 0.0052 or negative 0.5%. What does that mean? Okay, this is really tricky. What this means is if you have more schooling, you converge faster. So the fact that this is negative means convergence is happening. There's an additional impact of convergence, but it's based on how much schooling you have. So when you put it in this way, it makes sense, right? Which countries are going to converge the fastest? The countries that have the most schooling. Why? Because it's actually relatively easy to increase capital. But what is much harder to do quickly is to increase education, because it takes time to increase education, right? I mean, you can build capital fairly quickly, but building human capital takes generations. And so what this is capturing the fact is that countries that have better schooling or more schooling have the potential of converging faster than that 2.5%. They can converge 3%, right, on average. And that may not sound like much, but yeah, it's a lot, right? It's a lot. And so that's a fairly intuitive explanation, right? That result, I think, makes sense to us. Okay, next we have fertility. What's fertility? Fertility is the average number of live births per woman. Okay, average number of live births per woman. So in this data set, the highest ratio is 7. There are some sub-Saharan African countries that have averaged between 6 and 7 live births per woman. Okay, that is a very, very high number. What's the coefficient here? It's significant Is it positive or negative? Negative, right? Meaning higher fertility rates means slower growth. Is this Solow or is this Romer? More babies means lower growth.
Solow.
It's Solow, right? This is a very Malthusian result. Okay. Now, fertility is not the same thing as population, right? Because, you know, one of the things that we see is that in these countries that have very high fertility rates, they also have relatively high infant mortality rates. So a lot of these children do not actually become adults. But yeah, you know, this result really indicates this is more of a Solow result, right? More of a Malthusian result, that higher fertility rates tend to reduce growth rates. Government consumption. This is basically government spending. Kira, this is really the question of your literature review paper, right? Barrow's actually looking at this. What happens if we include a measure of government spending? He actually finds a negative relationship, meaning governments that spend more grow slower. How are we to interpret that? Well, I don't know exactly how we're to interpret that. And I think, you know, Kira will talk to us about this. I think other studies have done a much more in-depth look at what the relationship is between government spending and growth. Much more in depth than just kind of putting one variable in this model. But this seems to indicate that governments that spend more grow slower. And the argument that Barrow makes is government spending is often associated with corruption, right? Particularly, you know, across the 114 countries, you know, the governments in which the government plays a bigger role in GDP, they often do that because of corruption. There's a lot of wasted money. And so that's the argument that Barrow tries to make, that this is really more of a proxy for corruption. The Rule of Law Index. This is an index that looks at how well your legal and criminal justice systems work. And this is positive, suggesting that countries that have better legal systems have higher balanced growth paths. That makes sense to us, right? I mean, legal systems are a cornerstone of good institutions, right? And so that makes a lot of sense. Terms of trade. This is really a measure of how open your economy is. And once again, this is positive, suggesting that economies that are more open have higher balanced growth paths. Okay, then he has, we're getting close to the end here, democracy index, looking at how democratic the country is. And then he has democracy index squared. What in the world is he doing here? Well, here he is looking at the possibility of a nonlinear relationship. He's looking at a coefficient on democracy and then a second coefficient on democracy squared. And what he finds is that this one is greater than 0, but this one is less than 0. So how do we interpret that? That the relationship is nonlinear, but it looks something like this. Okay? Now, once again, this is a result that actually seems to make a lot of sense with the things that we've talked about in class. The idea here is, in everything, that what do you want? You want balance. You want the Goldilocks government, right? That balances too much elite control versus too much populism. And so what happens down here when you have too much or too little democracy? You have elites that have too much power, right? And you're going to tend to get autocrats or dictators, and they're going to stifle growth. What happens up here? Well, you have the majority. The majority has too much power, and you get populism. Are you all familiar with what I mean by populism? I mean, populism at its simplest is basically majority rule. Majority rule. So, what's the problem with pure majority rule? Well, what happens if everybody wakes up today and says, you know what? Most of us are debtors. Most of us owe money. So let's just all agree we're not going to pay our bills anymore. Screw the people who lend us money. Well, okay, that's fine today. The problem is, what happens over the long term? Nobody's going to lend money in the future if they know they're getting screwed over by majority rule. And so what we see in republics, right? And I guess one argument you could be saying here is this is the balanced republic. Such as the United States, right? The United States is not a pure democracy, and we've never claimed to be. That a balanced republic, what do they tend to do? They tend to balance majority rule versus kind of stability and institutionalizing some power, often in the hands of elites, right? And so you guys have all taken enough US history to know that this was really, the fundamental debate among our founding fathers, right? They were Democrats in the sense that they believed in voting and getting the public's will, but they weren't particularly democratic in the sense that they had lots of worry about just letting public will set all policy. And that's where you get this whole system of checks and balances. Checks and balances is another word for the shackled Leviathan, right? The government needs to have power to do things, but we don't want to have it too much power. Because if it has too much power, it might eat us. And so, I think this is in some sense what Barrow's finding here, right? I don't want to take this too far. And by the way, there are lots of other studies that have kind of looked at the relationship between democracy and growth in a much more substantive way. In fact, probably the most famous of these studies is another paper by Acemoglu and Johnson, right? They have kind of cornered the market here on democracy and growth. But I think there's better studies than this one that kind of look at this relationship. But these results are consistent with this story that Acemoglu and Johnson were telling on Wednesday, right? That the best government is that Goldilocks government, right? That kind of balances having power in the hands of a few elites versus having power in the hands of majorities. Okay, and then finally, the last set of results here. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one more. Inflation. Not surprisingly, Barrow finds that countries that have higher inflation rates have lower balanced growth paths. And so Barrow really is using this as a proxy for just macroeconomic policy, right? If you have high inflation, you do not have a particularly well-run macro policy. And so this is not surprising either, that countries that have high inflation have lower balanced growth paths, right? in part because inflation itself is bad, but usually because you know from your other econ classes that high inflation is usually a symptom of other economic problems, right? Excessive debt, bad management, inability to kind of collect taxes or collect reasonable taxes. So in many ways, this is just kind of a proxy for all sorts of bad government policy. The last variables here are dummy variables. And I guess we didn't talk about dummy variables. Do any of you know what a dummy variable is? Yeah, Chase, what's a dummy variable?
It's sometimes we call it like an indicator variable. It basically indicates whether there's something or not something. So it's a 1 or a 0.
Right.
A flat increase for having something.
Yes, or a yes-no, right? A yes-no. 1 is yes, 0 is no. So it's a way to pick up qualitative data, right? As opposed to quantitative data that has numbers, we can also put in our models qualitative aspects. And so what Barrow has included here is what region of the world you're in, right? So if the country that we're looking at is from sub-Saharan Africa, it's a 1 for the sub-Saharan African dummy, but then it's a 0 for the Latin American dummy and a 0 for the East Asian dummy. And so this is really looking at, is there an impact of being in a different region of the world? And notice here that these coefficients are not statistically significant. So while the dummy for sub-Saharan Africa is negative, the dummy for Latin America is negative, it's not statistically, neither of them are statistically significant. And so Barrow says, well, to him, that makes sense, right? That in other words, countries are not poor just because they're in Africa. What we see is that African countries are poor because they don't have very good institutions, right? In other words, African countries are poor because they have a very low balanced growth path. So that's the Barrow model, right? That's the Barrow model. Interestingly, just really quickly, Barrow says, you know what? The thing about this model is it doesn't just explain growth, it also explains, in the Solow model, S, right? S is the savings rate or the investment ratio. And so he does one other table here where he basically includes the same variables. And what does he find? That these variables have a direct impact on growth, but they also have a direct impact on the savings rate. And so in some sense, there's a lot of endogeneity here, right? In other words, it's hard to say exactly why these things matter. Do they matter directly on growth or do they matter through the savings rate? Probably most of these variables matter both ways, right? So like, for instance, an increase in life expectancy directly improves growth, but it also indirectly improves growth by encouraging savings. And that's probably true for almost all of these variables: schooling, international trade, democracy, right? It has a direct impact, but it also has an indirect impact. Okay. So that's the Barrow model, right? That's the Barrow model. And once again, let me just kind of remind you why I spent time looking through this. The first reason is because many of you are going to see these kind of papers that either talk about the Barrow model or use some version of the Barrow model, or just kind of do econometric results like this. And so while I don't expect you to understand everything in your papers, you can't, right? These are written by PhD economists for PhD economists. So I don't expect you to understand everything, but I do think that you can get the important insights, the important empirical insights from these papers. And so now that we've kind of read a few of these papers together, my hope is that you're getting a little bit better at doing this. And so when it comes time for you to really dig into your papers that you're going to cover in your literature review, you're better at that. And then also, I do want you to be familiar with, this Barrow model, because this is going to be something that almost certainly will be referred to in some of your articles, right? Because they'll say, for instance, well, I think brain drain is really important in explaining growth. How do I prove it? Well, I'm going to take the Barrow model, and then I'm going to add a variable that captures brain drain. And then let's see if that has some additional explanatory variables, right? So that's just one example of how many researchers have tried to look at other questions related to economic growth that Barrow did not include in his basic model. So hopefully that's setting you all up, right? Setting you all up for thinking about this stuff. So, all right, so that's really it for today. So remember, each of you have to send me your paper proposal, right? Do it as soon as you can. Please no later than 5 o'clock, because I won't be grading these tonight. So if you want to get some feedback, so you're ready to go tomorrow, send it to me as soon as you can today. And then, good luck working on your paper. If questions come up, by all means, send me an email, right? I'm happy to try to answer questions as I can. It's better to send me an email than to kind of waste hours, stewing on something that I can answer pretty easily. So send me an email. And then where are we headed next week? Well, of course, we're going to be working on your paper, but next week we're really going to have, I would say that the amount of time that we spend in class is going to definitely diminish, right? Because I really do want us to be working on papers. I want to be available to kind of talk to you individually as you have questions. So we're going to continue to talk about, I would say, some other topics related to growth that we haven't really talked about yet, some smaller topics. So we're going to come back and kind of hit a variety of topics next week. We're going to talk about what more can we say about the relationship between population growth and economic growth. We're going to talk a little bit about health in economic growth. I want to spend a day talking about what's the role of pandemics in economic growth, right? This is just out of today's headlines, right? In fact, I spent most of yesterday kind of putting together what I think is a very nice little lecture for us on that question, and some other variety of topics. We're going to talk about the role of culture in economic growth, right? So some other kind of assorted topics that I think are interesting for us to talk about. But our discussions next week are going to be decidedly less technical. And as I said, we're for the most part, I think we're going to stick to just having morning classes, and we won't have afternoon classes. So you'll have more time to either work on your paper, to go visit people in the writing studio, which I absolutely encourage you to do. And it's probably better to do it before you send out that first draft, right? So the more polished you can get this paper in the first draft, I think the more likely that you're going to end up in a really good place. So anyway, so we'll kind of cut down on the class hours a little bit and kind of ease up some. So you have that to look forward to. All right. So anybody have any other questions about anything? Okay. Well, if not, have a good weekend. Good luck on that paper proposal. I'm going to stay around for a couple of minutes. So if any of you want to talk about your exam, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone.